May this new year be filled with health, happiness, peace, to continue the good work that is so much needed for First Nations children and families.
2022 began with hope. After decades of legal wrangling, Ottawa signed a major $20 billion agreement in principle with the Assembly of First Nations executive and class action lawyers. It was to compensate First Nations children and their families victimized by a chronically underfunded child welfare system. Indigenous Services Canada Minister Patty Hajdu said it was a lesson learned at a press conference in early January.
I hope the lesson that we're learning, as I said earlier, is that discriminatory funding for Indigenous people in this country is not just harmful and wrong and morally repugnant, but that it is shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of prosperity for the entire country.
The Liberals also put forward another $20 billion to reform the child welfare system itself, but in the end it was not to be so easy. In October, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal said Ottawa's agreement still does not meet the terms of its 2016 landmark ruling, including providing each child and family with a minimum compensation payment of $40,000. And at the AFN Winter Assembly, First Nations leaders passed an emergency resolution calling on the Trudeau government to meet all terms of the CHRT decision. Here's what First Nations Child and Family Caring Society Executive Director Cindy Blackstock had to say in December.
Is that these were victims who already were entitled to $40,000 through legal orders, and under the old arrangement they would have seen that go down to zero. Now, thanks to the leadership, that's going to remain at 40, and so that's what the agreement needs to deal with.
In November, the Liberals passed legislation ending mandatory minimum sentences. These types of sentences tend to affect minority groups disproportionately, including Indigenous women who now make up a staggering 50% of the female prison population. Bill C-5 takes mandatory minimums for most drug and some firearms offenses off the books, but others, such as those for murder, sexual offenses, and impaired driving, remain. And the new legislation left a lot of justice reform advocates, including Senator Kim Pate, disappointed.
The reality is, if mandatory minimum penalties made us safer, then the United States should be the safest place in the world. And if implementing them is soft on crime, then show us the evidence that jailing more and more Indigenous women and putting more and more of their kids in state care is going to make us safer.
The overall high percentage of Indigenous people in Canadian jails continued to dog the Liberal government in 2022. This in spite of making up only 5% of the Canadian population. Indigenous people make up about 32% of the prison population, and these numbers show no signs of decreasing anytime soon. As a result, Canada's correctional investigator once again blasted the government when he released his annual report in early November.
And for an organization that spends so much money to have poor correctional outcome, especially for Indigenous prisoners as well as for Black prisoners, is a real shame and something that Canadians should be concerned with.
On a more positive note, history was made in August when Michelle O'Bonsawin became the first Indigenous woman to be appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada. Here's what the member of the Odanak First Nation in Quebec had to say to parliamentarians.
But at the end of the day, if you work hard and your heart's in it, you could go and do what you want. And I'm hoping that young people, female Indigenous women also, will see that anything is possible if you set your mind to it.
And we couldn't end the year in review without talking about the Freedom Convoy movement, which literally took over the streets of downtown Ottawa from late January to late February. Semi-trucks, flag-waving protesters, and even the odd bouncy castle were all part of it. APTN News talked to Brendan Nimkus Addison, First Nations heavy truck mechanic from Manitoulin Island. He said he experienced nothing but positive vibes in the anti-vaccine movement and felt it was being misportrayed in the mainstream media.
The other side that I feel that's not being shared is there's a lot of compassion. There's a lot of compassion and support from Canadian citizens all across Canada and even beyond Canada for what's going on here, because it's truly about more than just truckers and being able to have a border mandate removed now.
Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.